Hello, hello, and welcome to another podcast episode of Overpowering Emotions, where I talk all things big emotions, emotion regulation. I'm still talking about self-regulation. I actually had quite a few comments and questions about self-regulation and a lot of references to self-control. And I wanted to dig in a little bit more because self-regulation is not self-control, but a lot of people confuse them as the same and they use them interchangeably. So I wanted to talk about that. So self-control is not a core executive function or self sort of regulatory capacity. Even though we're using those words, it is part of a executive skill, but there's a difference here. So, like I talked about in previous episodes, in a really simple way, self-regulation is a broader sort of process with a network of skills in the brain that help us set a goal and then manage our thoughts, our feelings, and behaviors to reach whatever those standards are. So it's this sort of whole system of standards, thoughts, processes, and the actions that we're going to take to be successful in whatever it is that we're trying to do, whether it's a long-term goal or it's getting ready for school or some immediate, thing that we need to do. So really it's all of those processes from setting the goal, monitoring self, monitoring the environment, changing our behavior to make sure we're meeting that. Okay. There's a component of getting started, a component of sticking with itness, right? All of those things. Lots of other components too, like having self-awareness as well as understanding of other people's reactions and things like that. Self-control, though, isn't such a big, broad network of skills. It's really sort of a subset or just a little specific capacity within self-regulation. Traditionally, the view was really about resisting temptation, sort of thing, right? Inhibiting our impulses. So, really about willpower, which can be easily depleted because we know, and there's lots of research. I think the classic research is, you know, participants come in and they're offered cookies or something. I can't remember the exact circumstances, but they're offered cookies or fruit. And so those who were really having to, or radishes, I think it was, right? So those who used their willpower to not eat the cookies later on had problems using their willpower because it got depleted. They didn't have any more willpower left. Think about through the day, right? If you've tried to lose weight, during the morning, you might be great. You have a great breakfast, you avoid the donuts, you have a salad at lunch, but at the end of the day, you've used all that willpower. You're exhausted. There's a bag of cookies. You're going to eat the cookies, right? That willpower really depletes. So, in a really simple way, but it's a bit reductionistic because, we do know a little bit more about how effortful it is to suppress that impulse, to not take the cookie, to not have the donuts, right? But it's also about developing healthy habits, what we can do instead, and really importantly, modifying the environment for us to be successful. So maybe you just don't have cookies at home at the end of the day. Shanker does a lot of work in self regulation. If you're interested in reading his work, that's one framework when we're looking at self regulation. And he really strongly differentiates between self regulation as that process of of being able to regulate that self regulation, and self control is sort of more the action. So self regulation is what makes self control possible. Okay. If a kiddo is highly stressed, they can't exercise self-control. So the focus needs to be on reducing stress, enhancing that self-regulation, right? Because self-control sort of comes from that ability to self-regulate. It's sort of this natural emergence. So the approach is really emphasizing understanding the underlying causes of dysregulation rather than just trying to impose this behavioral control. So, all this to say, I just want to bring it back to the fact that self control plays a really important role in social skills. And that's really what I was going to get to and wanted to think about it almost like a social skill, because it does involve those internal processes like managing our impulses, delaying gratification. But self control, it really develops and operates primarily within our interpersonal world, right? Within the social context of our world. Even just thinking about how we develop this skill from infancy, self-control really emerges through that co-regulation with the caregivers in our life, right? The adults are helping children manage their physiological, their emotional different states that they're experiencing. So over time, kids can start to internalize those regulatory processes. but they're learning it through these repeated social interactions. Attachment obviously plays a key role here. We know that kiddos with secure attachments, that plays a huge factor in predicting better emotional regulation and behavioral inhibition later on. So that's a huge piece. So, modeling and social referencing are important here too. Children are watching adults all the time and they're learning to imitate how adults and peers are really responding to different situations like frustration or temptation. So, if a parent is able to model, maybe pausing, maybe they're breathing, they're taking that step back when they're frustrated, the child is more likely to try that behavior in similar situations as well. For me, I taught my 18-month-old babies to say, I'm frustrated, however they can use their words and whatever vocabulary they have, and take a little walk just to create that pause so that we can then go and problem solve. And that was something I modeled and modeled and modeled. We need to also scaffold the self-regulation through where we're prompting, we're praising what we do want to see, we're redirecting, right? And so we're using these social mechanisms to help guide that internal development for them. So self-control, it's not an innate trait. It's not this isolated personality piece, right? It's really something that emerges through the socialization that we have with kids, through modeling and that interactive sort of feedback, those loops that they're getting. Now, an important function, another, when we're looking at the social piece, a function of self-control is usually to comply with social norms, to maintain relationships, to be able to function cooperatively in groups. So when we're looking at, the definition of self-control, they actually define it as the capacity to alter our responses to bring them in line with whatever the social expectations are. That makes sense. As a species, we have this evolved sort of fundamental need to belong. And if you've heard me talk before, I've talked a lot about this underlying fundamental need. And so this need to belong, it really encourages those behaviors that are going to be consistent with being a good group member, being a good human, right? And so we don't want to put ourselves at risk for being excluded from the group. Without that self-control, we might, for example, just thinking back 250,000 years, I mean, we just might eat if we're hungry, we'll eat without restraint until we're stuffed. But now we could be monopolizing all of those group resources. And so that's putting the whole group membership at risk, right, of going hungry. So there's a huge cost when we're looking at that. So if they're creating these dynamics and this conflict within the group, that's really going to threaten their status within the group, right? So that's why those behavioral inhibitions, just because we want to eat until we're stuffed, doesn't mean we actually can. They're really important for peaceful social interactions. And we know, we've seen this in the research, people with poor self-control, they're at greater risk for problems like discrimination and violence, right? They might respond more aggressively to insults. They might engage in more problematic misbehaviors. So self-control is needed. I mean, you name it. We need self-control. It's needed for discussing sensitive topics, just to avoid being offensive or being misinterpreted. It's important for being kind, especially if, maybe our friend is engaging in bad behavior, right? So how can we respond in helpful ways despite what else is going on? Maybe there's demanding adults in our world. So we need to inhibit our impulses. Um, to keep our friends. Maybe we got to keep our hands to ourselves. If someone's making us mad, we can't go around punching people in the face all the time, right? We want to make sure we're having those smooth social interactions. That delayed gratification, maybe we are waiting to get the treat, to get dinner. We're just respecting the fairness in norms. Maybe we're trying to gain approval from others. All of these things are important. From an evolutionary perspective, it really makes sense. Sometimes we have to mask or modulate our emotional expression sometimes. We all do this. We all mask sometimes. Maybe we're hiding our disappointment, right? We need to, we're up for a big award. We don't win. We have to be able to show appreciation for the winner. We can't be sore losers, right? Going into interviews, we need to put forward our best foot to get a good impression. Okay. We do need to remember, though, if we're presenting this desired image, that really taxes self-control resources. So if kiddos are using up all their effort to try to be good, to be a good friend, to be this little being that doesn't come naturally for them, it can really make it harder for them to control things later on. And I know a lot of our ADHD kiddos, I mean, even my own daughter has struggled with this. She's just sarcastic and fast, and she's just got quick quips and she's very funny, right? She's just got this, but it's really she's got to maintain control that and stop herself in the moment because not everybody appreciates that and it can get her into trouble. But then she's more emotional at the end of the day because all day she's trying to think about what is the appropriate thing? What is it that I should or should not be saying in this moment? Okay. So when we look at it through this sort of lens, self-control really serves an important social function, helping us maintain acceptance, maintain trust and cooperation within our social group. Okay. So, because otherwise, poor self-control, we're rejected. We have conflicts all the time, right? Maybe we're getting in trouble all the time. It's not just internal distress. It's about all of these social pieces that are going on. And self-control, we do know, varies depending on the context around us, who is around us. We know kids are able to exhibit more self-control when they're with adults who they trust, right? Or with adults they want to impress. That's why I'm always talking about how important the relationship is. I can get kids to do things that parents had no clue that was even possible. And I'm like, hey, how did you do that? Like, what was it? And they're like, I didn't want to disappoint you, right? That's where we want to get kids. I don't ever use punishment. I don't ever want to do that. But sure, knowing that my relationship is important to them, that's huge. That can make a big difference, right? I mean, this is why peer influence can really make a big difference too. It can enhance or diminish self-control depending on what the group norms are. So peer pressure can be really good to reduce restraint, especially if there's no other adults around there, or if you've got supportive peers that can enhance their restraint. Don't do that bad thing, right? So peers have a lot of sway too, oftentimes because, there's other factors going on. But we can really see just the context and the people and the kind of relationships that we have. Now, emotion regulation, it's really facilitated through social regulation too, right? We know co-regulation really is needed until our kiddos are well into adulthood, right? That's always important, especially when they're feeling stressed, especially when those big emotions come up. We need to co-regulate. So we can really see how self-control, just a little subset piece of self-regulation, really fluctuates based on social dynamics. It's not a fixed inherent trait within them. And we see this too, when we're looking at the brain, we see that the prefrontal cortex, right, that's the part that is important for self-regulation and it's central to self-control as well. It's highly sensitive to social information, and certain parts of the brain are activated during tasks that require social evaluation and self-monitoring within the group. So self-control tasks, when we're looking at, it's engaging those social cognition circuits. So we see that direct overlap between the self-control and understanding how other people might perceive or judge our behaviors, for example. Okay. So this is just supporting that idea that self-control is really entangled in social processing. So why is this even important, right? Like, let me break it down. Why are we even listening to this? And thank you for, continuing to listen if you're still here, because sometimes people are like, whatever. But I think it's important for us to think about. Maybe think about what your own learning is right now in this moment, why I'm telling you this, right? Why it's a social sort of skill and function. That's why we want to look at it, especially when we're looking at teaching strategies. When we're teaching strategies, we can focus on strategies that are emphasizing that relational safety, the social modeling, the social connection. It's not about willpower. We got to stop telling kids just to, pick up their socks and get more motivated and put the fire under their butt. It's all relational. And so that's really important, right? We see kids who are living in these adverse or sort of chaotic environments, they usually struggle with self-control because there's a lot of inconsistencies and dysregulation. They're not getting the co-regulation, right? They might even have disrupted attachment. So when we're viewing self-control as a social skill and sort of an environmental consideration, it just really helps open the door to teach it within that empathy and connection interpersonal framework rather than contingencies that are focused on punishment or shame, which never work. They just never work. So, just a really simple example, you've got a kiddo who's trouble has trouble managing that frustration, right? Especially, kiddos with ADHD, for example, but any child who's struggling to manage that frustration. Traditional approaches might focus on teaching self-control through sticker charts, rewards, punishments. But if we're really understanding self-control as this relational skill, the focus is really shifting to building predictable routines. The relationships, of course, and the co-regulation, but how can we help them be successful through managing frustration? Of course, repetitive practice is going to be really important. We're going to be modeling those strategies as well. When we get frustrated out loud, we want to model those strategies. We're going to narrate our own self-control efforts. And we can use collaborative problem solving with the kiddos. I'll be talking about that in coming weeks, right? So we want to problem solve. Okay, this is usually what happens when you go and play this game and you lose, this frustration shows up. Frustrated Fred shows up. And so how can we work together so that frustration doesn't show up, that you can be the boss of frustration? Let's go practice it. I mean, it's all social mechanisms that we're really supporting that internal control when we're looking at the development. So yes, self-control does involve those internal regulation skills, but when we're looking at its development, its expression, its function, it's all rooted in the social world. Okay, so that's why we really want to think about it as this socially constructed skill that arises early in relationships. It's practiced regularly within social norms, and it's supported through ongoing interpersonal connection, right? It's not about the punishment. It's about creating the relationships and the environments that are going to help them be successful, right? There's that safety, the trust, the modeling, all of those things. And I've got loads of episodes, talking about each of those pieces. So I'll leave it there for today. As always, I will make sure I put some homework ideas in the notes that you can access. Of course, anytime, feel free to, email me, reach out to me if you have any questions or, implementation. How do we implement this? In the meantime, though, go help those kiddos be bold and courageous, and I will see you next time.